so much. It's just so amazing to like see people here, and it's so lovely to have so many people that I know and love here tonight, waving and clapping in that weird Zoom way that we do. So I'm going to read a short bit from the book, and then Kristen and I will chat. So for context, just in terms of names that are important for this little bit, Maggie is the main character. She's just returned home after her mother has died. Her mother is named Iris and her father is named Peter. And the scene is when she goes to find her mother's will after being instructed on where she's supposed to probably find it, or where she thinks she's going to find it. And Ariel is her brother. When she gets home, Maggie goes right into Iris and Peter's bedroom, into the walk-in closet that her mother transformed into a miniature home office. The file cabinet is neat, with folders for medical bills, legal things, taxes, and even a folder that's titled, in the same block lettering Iris used in crossword puzzles, Margaret and Ariel, Childhood. Maggie finds report cards, drawings, little notes she and Ariel wrote to their parents and to each other. There's a drawing of Jasmine from Disney's Aladdin, only recognizable because of the turquoise of her clothes and the orange and black striped thing by her side that's meant to be her tiger. There are hearts all over the page around the misshapen drawing. Maggie's very first crush. Did Iris know that's what it was? There are 2 slim baby books tucked into this folder as well, one for her and one for Ariel. All their early statistics are there: weight and length at birth, first smile, first laugh, first crawl, first step, first word. Maggie's was, apparently, boots. She smiles. She still loves boots. The first thing she'd bought herself with the money she made babysitting when she was 15 was a pair of Doc Martens. She was such a baby gay cliche, she thinks. And, apparently, a pretty gay baby, too. The will. That's what she needs to find now. She puts the folder full of nostalgia back and keeps looking, but it's not in the top drawer. She opens the bottom one, which is almost empty, save for 2 folders. One is labeled Old Menus, which looks like it's full of exactly that. Takeout menus, graying with age, edges crumbling. Maggie has no idea why her mother would save those. Behind it is a folder that reads simply, Wills. There are 2 files inside, and Maggie leaves Peter's alone, opening her mother's. The blur on some lettering suggests it's a photocopy, or maybe just a bad printing job. She skims past the legalese, some of which is familiar to her from work, the shelts and their twos and mentions of estates, rests, and residues, not as daunting as they'd been before she learned how to read and explain the contracts she was having clients sign. But most of it seems standard, the surviving husband, Peter, being the beneficiary. Her eyes lock on a section titled Instructions that mentions Iris's request that the letters enclosed be sent out in the case of her untimely death. Maggie checks the folder again, but Peter's will is the only other thing there. She leans up and looks into the drawer again, and yes, there they are, a small stack of letters at the back under the hanging organizer. She takes them out and turns back to the will. On the next page, under the section that reads Specific Bequests, she sees that her mother has left Ariel her engagement and wedding rings. She's left Maggie the amber necklace, the one that's still in her pocket. She's not sure how long she sits there on the floor, cross-legged, staring at the brief paragraph. Blood drums in her ears. She can feel her pulse at the base of her throat. She's furious. Of course Iris left the rings to Ariel, valued his prospects of marriage over Maggie's. It's 2017, she wants to shout at Iris. I can marry whoever I want. I can propose to a woman and marry a woman and have children with her. But no, of course. Even beyond the shadow of the valley of death or whatever, her mother is disapproving of Maggie's, quote, lifestyle choices, unquote. But it's worse, really. Until now, Maggie has never had a committed relationship, and Iris didn't know about Lucia. Could she have smelled something on Maggie? An inability to commit? A failure at love? She tries to push this away. Iris knew nothing about her. And the necklace, what is that, she thinks, some kind of pity gift? She knows it was her grandmother's, but it's nothing special, just a stone and chain without a story. She never even saw Bubby wearing it, Maggie thinks, bitterness rising in her esophagus. Just an arbitrary good luck charm her mother wore on trips, a charm that failed spectacularly during Iris's last and extremely brief one. It's so gendered, too, Maggie fumes. Like, what, boys can't wear necklaces? But no, apparently the big, obviously expensive rings are for Ariel to bestow upon his future boring bride so he can have future boring kids in boring suburbia. Iris never made a secret of her discomfort with her daughter being gay, but she'd stopped being so overt about it in recent years, which Maggie took as a sign that she'd given up trying to change her. There was still an edge to her mother's tone when she asked Maggie if she was dating anyone, always the implication being that perhaps, just once, the anyone would be a man. But still, Iris had listened without obvious judgment when Maggie told her about the occasional work she did with queer youth in St. Louis, the college prep tutoring at an affirming church, and the local LGBTQI I2S plus suicide prevention hotline she volunteered with for a couple of years before they merged with a larger national organization. She even sounded mildly interested when Maggie told her about the Pride Center opening. But now Maggie realizes that Iris was preparing for this spiteful act the whole time. It had all been a sham, Iris just biting her tongue rather than actually accepting any of it. Fuck you too, Mom, Maggie tells the filing cabinet. She imagines Iris sitting at the small desk chair beside her, tapping on her phone in that slow, older lady way, not listening because she's dealing with work. Fuck you very much. She stuffs the will back in the drawer and slams it so hard it bounces back. Tomorrow morning is the funeral, she thinks, and Ariel's pot sucks. She finds Gina's number in her phone and calls. Calling isn't a thing she and Gina do much. It's not a thing Maggie really does with anyone anymore. She's pretty sure today was the first time she talked to Lucia on the phone, though they did have video chat sex a couple months ago when Lucia was out of town for 2 weeks at an artist residency. Gee, Maggie says. Yeah, hi, I'm in town. Yeah, I know. It wasn't planned. My mom died. No, not shitting you. Yeah, thanks. Look, I want to see you for sure, but also I really need something to get through tomorrow. Are you still selling? Thank you.
Yay! Yes, please, everybody clap. Yay! I am so thrilled and feel very honored to be able to be in conversation with you on this very special book birthday of this debut, beautiful, gay book. I have a million questions I want to ask you, and I will never get through all of them, but I'm going to try and get through as many as I can, and then let everybody else ask you the million questions that they'll have. So, like, first off, I'm just going to go ahead and ask you about, like, what was, like, the genesis of this book? Like, was there, like, a specific image or something that prompted you into writing this particular novel? And then also, like, what did that look like, the process of writing it itself?
Yeah, so you know that thing that writers do where they have an idea in the middle of the night and then they're too lazy to get up and write it down?
Sure, yes.
Yes, so you know how most of the time you forget that brilliant idea that you had in the morning, or the times that you're not lazy enough to get up and write it down, you find out in the morning that it wasn't brilliant at all and it was just like a really bizarre line and it meant nothing and there's nothing to do with it. This was one of those really weird instances where I couldn't fall asleep. It was the fall of 2017. I couldn't sleep. And I just kept having this line running through my head that I just kept sort of reworking as I was trying to sleep. And it was basically the opening line of the book. I didn't have Ariel's name yet, but the rest of it is almost the same. Just this image of Maggie being eaten out, and getting the phone call that her mother is dead, and like, what do you do with that?
Right.
You know? So that was where it started from, and I remembered it in the morning, right? So like that was the shocking thing. I remembered it when I woke up, and then I went and wrote it down, and then I started thinking about, who is this person? Who is Maggie? I don't know anything about her. Who is her mother? Why is her mother dead? Why is her brother calling to tell her about it? Why does she pick up the phone in the middle of sex? Right? Like all of these questions. And I just started doing a lot of background writing and figuring it out, just sort of like journaling, which I don't do. I mean, this is not like my process. This was just the process for this book.
Yeah. I think it's the thing that happens sometimes, right? Where it's like, if it's a very specific work, then it's like, it creates its own process, right?
Exactly. And so I wasn't expecting it to go that way, but it did. And once I sort of figured out, I've been saying this part a lot, but I feel like once I figured out that I had an actual plot with this book, which is not what I had with other books that I'd sent out and tried to sell. Although I would not admit that to the agents at all. I will insist still that the books that I sent them did have plots, but this one had a plot that I thought other people would also agree was a plot, and I got excited, and so I started to like really work on it. And I did it in sort of short spurts because I was in my program here. So I did sort of 1 month right after I had that idea, and then another month in the summer, and then another month after that, and then I edited it, and then I sent it off and crossed my fingers real hard.
Yeah. Wow. Well, yeah, I mean, I think that feels like a lot of those things, right? Where it's like, right when the project that we're supposed to be working on finally comes to us, it's this thing where it's kind of like a weird little light bulb. But I mean, yeah, for sure. I mean, kind of swinging off of that, this is a book that has a very specific structure to it, right? Like it's going in time, but it also doesn't just have it doesn't just have Maggie. It also has like the voice of her mother, Iris, in it. What was like, did you see that like from the beginning? Did you see it as being this kind of the duality of having like the mother and daughter's voice when you were writing it in this kind of way?
No, I didn't know that at first. So at first I was really just with Maggie. And then I sort of figured out that in order to sort of explore more of the background, right? I mean, having her meet the men that she delivers these letters to wouldn't be enough, because that would just be having conversations, and it wouldn't allow readers the window into sort of what Iris's reality was like.
Right.
And I mean, the sort of tragedy for me about their relationship is this idea that every part of the book that we see Iris in is something that the readers get, but that Maggie never will. Right? She never gets to see those moments, and she never gets to see what her mother was like in those moments, how they're similar they might be. And so that to me was sort of the tension that I wanted to play with. Once I figured that out, that we needed to see that.
Yeah. I mean, that's like so much of like domestic dynamic too, is right. It's like the idea that we think we know other people that are in our like family, and family is like such a broad kind of subjective thing, right? Like, especially when we're talking about queer people, like much of the time, like families like built and community and things like that. Was it like, did you find it harder to write from the viewpoint of her mother? Or did you find it harder to write from the viewpoint of Maggie?
I think I found it harder to write from the viewpoint of Maggie, actually, partially because of where she's at, which is this place of grief and anger during the days in which we see her. And that was a sort of painful and uncomfortable space to inhabit so much of the time. Whereas Iris, sometimes she's in moments of grief, sometimes she isn't, but she's more fun in some ways. I don't know if everyone will agree with that, but I
agree with that. I would agree with that for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And she's kind of, I don't know, she's a little more carefree a lot of the time than Maggie. I mean, Maggie's so in her head.
Yeah.
And something that a writing teacher of mine told me when I was in college was that was very affirming at the time, was that I wrote old people well. I mean, at the time, by old people, he didn't actually mean old people. I think he meant like adults his age. But I was young, and so he perceived it as old people for me. So in that way, I've kind of enjoyed writing Iris.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very interesting. It kind of leads me into a question that, because you write Iris from this viewpoint of something I'm very interested in, I think many people are interested in, is seeing like women of various ages portrayed as fully fleshed out human beings with like, right, like stuff that they're fucked up about, but also stuff that they excel at, and also is like fully realized like sexual beings. And that's like something that's fully realized absolutely through these letters, right? It's like the things that are discovered that, you know, her daughter discovers about her that are like deeply infuriating to her as a person. But this is like a fully realized adult woman who has like a very fulfilling and broad sexual life, and was like what was like the impulse and drive for you to write that? I know for me it's because I want to read it, but like for you, what was in the writing it?
I mean, I think that's part of it, right? Because part of it is that I'm deeply frustrated by the fact that we have a kind of cult of youth, right? I mean, the fact that we are meant to, I mean, women are sort of supposed to believe in our current culture that, you know, once you hit, I don't know, the age creeps up slowly kind of as we progress and inch along with things. But I don't know, now it's what, 35, 40, maybe, if we're lucky, if we have progressive values. But that's like the end somehow. Like that's when, I don't know, sex stops, romance stops, just everything, your entire body dries up and gets shriveled, and that's the end. And that's not true. I mean, it's not true. We know it's not true. I mean, people always make that joke about, like, oh, there's STDs in, you know, elder care facilities. And it's like, okay, but the reason people make jokes about that is because they're uncomfortable with the fact that, yeah, elders, people who are above a particular age that we've decided is sort of unworthy of being human, are still getting it on, are still having sex, are still having fun. And that's great.
Yeah,
and I'm just
so for myself
not seeing that. So I wanted to explore that, because I don't know about you, but I'm not planning on like not having a sex life when I get to be above 40 or 45 or 50.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Agreed. Strong agree. I think we have strong agreement even from the audience. This is a book, like when I read it, I was lucky enough that I got to read an arc of this book. But like the first thing I thought of, like upon even reading this book, right? You even mentioned in the first page, like the opening scene is like is like the main character getting like eaten out. And it's like this, it's like extremely queer book. But it does a thing that I am so passionate about and love to see in writing, which is that the emphasis of the book isn't on someone's queerness. It's on like, this is like a trajectory of a lot of other things from a person who happens to be queer, right? It's somebody who's going through a lot and they happen to be queer. What was it like for you writing, like, I was looking specifically, because this is a queer book, like writing a very specifically queer book?
It felt really natural, you know, I mean, partially because I'm just so enlivened by queer stories, and because I do feel that queerness is not just sort of an identity, but it's also a way of viewing the world, right? Like there's a kind of, I mean, when we talk about the queer gaze, G-A-Z-E,
Right.
G-A-Z-E, that means something, right? It's a kind of attempt at seeing the world a certain way, or a kind of slanted view of something, of how our reality is. And so to me, I mean, that's obviously just how I see the world. That's how I think about it, right? And writing a book that was queer, but that was not sort of focused on the queerness as sort of like a discovery or as a secret. It partially also came from the fact that, you know, those stories, there are many of those stories that have yet to be told, right? But the stories about someone like Maggie, like a white girl in the suburbs, we have her coming out story, you know? And so while there are many coming out stories that we don't yet have and that deserve to still be written and seen, and like, I think that when people reject sort of the coming out story automatically, that's not fair, and it's kind of not okay, because we still have a very particular kind of coming out story that we've seen.
That's absolutely true. Yeah.
But we have seen Maggie's, you know, like someone like Maggie's coming out story exists. And I wanted to see like, okay, what is a different kind of coming of age, right? What is a coming of age that is about needing to sort of reckon with the fact that your parents are human beings as well as your parents.
Right.
Which is a different kind of process.
Right, absolutely. Yeah. I love that. I think you're absolutely right. That's like such a great way to think about that, the idea of like the coming out stories that we've received. Because a lot of times when I think about coming out stories, I'll think about like who are they being written for? And sometimes I wonder who the audience is, because it's sometimes a kind of trauma. It can turn into like a kind of trauma porn. But like, I love the idea of like, right, like the coming out stories, like there's space still for those ones that are like, that haven't been in like the current narrative. Okay, so speaking of queer relationships and love, there's a very specific relationship at the heart of this. I loved reading about Lucia and Maggie's quote unquote relationship throughout this, because it felt like so specifically like such a, this is a relationship because it's like, oh, I don't know what it is and I don't know how I feel. And because you're writing it very specifically about a character who has like a lot of control issues and a character who has a lot of intimacy issues. So what was that like writing like this character and their relationship that kind of peppers throughout, even though they're separated by distance? Like, what was that like?
Yeah, that was definitely challenging, because I wanted, I didn't want Lucia to sort of be there at the beginning and then disappear.
Right.
Partially because I think Maggie's never had someone like Lucia in her life who will stick with her in this kind of time, or she's never been with someone romantically in that way. And so I wanted to make sure that Lucia was around, even if she wasn't around physically, which meant needing to sort of think about the dynamics of cell phones and, needing to make sure that there was a reason for why she wouldn't check her notifications, or, like just all of these very technical things that I needed to think about. But I wanted to make sure that Lucia also didn't feel flat, because I worried, and I mean, I still worry, and I hope that she doesn't, that what I wanted to make sure was clear was that Lucia sort of has a whole life, right? She's her own fully realized person. And she just isn't in the book more than she is because she's not there. But I tried to drop hints throughout of sort of like, Lucia's like a person with a life and a history and a whole existence that is part of what draws Maggie to her, right? Like, it's the fact that she is a person who can be independent of her entirely.
Yeah.
That is so sort of sexy about her,
And I love the back and forth that you have of the character, which feels so supremely realistic to me, of her at times being like, I don't care, I'm not going to be responding, and I don't care. And then like at other times, like going through her Instagram and seeing stuff she's posted and kind of like self-loathing about like what's she doing, who took this photo, that kind of stuff, which is like feels like very real and kind of palpable from like a perspective of a person who like maybe doesn't know what they want, or doesn't know how to like maybe vocalize or like express like the way that what they would want and what they want the relationship to turn into. It felt like extremely authentic to me.
Yeah, and I think she's scared, right? Like, she's just scared that Lucia's gonna bolt because something bad happened, and she's not used to people sticking around when something bad happens. And so that, I think that's where the push-pull came from, right? Was like the idea of, oh, but I want to be with her, but no, she's gonna leave, so I should like definitely distance myself now.
Yes, very healthy behavior.
Very.
Something you brought up that I was also very interested in is because you implement a lot of these like current like social media kind of like technologies within the book that feel very natural, right? You like have references to like, here's what's happening like on this Facebook, here's what's happening on Instagram, like, right? Like when we're in times of grief or loss, like oftentimes it's a way that you are able to share it is through these kind of like social media portals. That's how we interact with and meet oftentimes people that we end up having relationships with. But then at the same time, like on the other side of that, you have these like letters, which is this kind of like traditional mode of interacting with just very specifically a person. So having like these written letters that she's hand delivering, right? Not even putting through the mail, but hand delivering letters juxtaposed with this technology of like, here's how I'm interacting with a person, the paramour of my life. Like that to me felt like very smart and super interesting. Was that something that you thought about when you were working on the book?
I wish I could say it was, because it sounds so smart and interesting now that you say it that way. But I think that literally the letters was like, ooh, I have a conceit and a plot. And then, oh, but it's 2017. She's not on social media. That would be weird. And then okay, the reason I keep looking down, by the way, is because, as I said before everyone else came in, my cat is now hanging around and she likes her. So
listen, everyone loves that. Everyone loves that.
So yeah, so I mean, I wish I had planned that, but no, that was just a total sort of accidental parallel that I guess works. Yay.
I feel like sometimes our brains kind of subconsciously do that shit for us, though. Like, don't you think so? Like sometimes
yes,
our brains like do it. Like we're not like maybe sitting down and thinking. Like there's definitely times where I've been like, oh shit, is that what that is?
Oh, of
like,
course. Of course. I mean, I think that 50% of anything that I write in a review of a book that like I love, I know that I know a lot is the thing that like, okay, the author was thinking about. And I know that maybe not 50%, but like maybe 20 or 30%. I know that they're going to look at, if it's like a really good review, right? They're going to look at and they're going to be like, ooh, I didn't intend for that to happen, but cool, I like it. But that's part of what happens with art, right? Like just things kind of juxtapose and become weirdly like this.
Mm-hmm. I think they do. I think they kind of like naturally build on each other, which is delightful because I couldn't do it.
Yeah, no.
I mean, another thing that this book is like very much addressing, right? Because it starts off with the death of Maggie's mother. This is a book that is talking about and discussing very specifically the idea of grief and loss and like what that looks like, especially with different people in a family and how they deal with it. Like, so that's something you had to have been thinking about and were deeply concerned with as you were working through the book. So like grief and loss, and like how do you see that trajectory as like working through the book in terms of the characters?
So something that I really sort of worried about when I was writing, and that it took a while to balance it, was sort of making sure that I showed Maggie's grief in a way that was not just sadness.
Yeah.
Because I think we often see depictions of grief, or I've often read depictions of grief that are kind of, about the sadness part of the grief. Mm-hmm. And that definitely is a big part of grief, right? Just the depression of it, or the deep kind of well of pain, or the stone that sits on your chest and hurts. Yeah. But there's also, grief is complicated. I think especially when someone dies who you have sort of unresolved stuff with, and that you didn't get to have it out with in any way, right? When it's sudden, or when it's cut off in this way. And so I wanted to make sure also to allow for space of anger. And Maggie is angry, and sort of the way that she deals with her grief through a lot of the book is anger. And I think that that's a place that many people go in grief too, right? I mean, it's a way of controlling the sadness in a way, right? It feels more manageable somehow. And so I was trying to sort of balance those things while also making sure that it wasn't just only, I'm sad about my dead mom, I'm sad about my dead mom, I'm angry at my dead mom, I'm angry at my dead mom, because that wouldn't be, that would just get very boring if that's all that happened throughout the entire book. Which is why sort of having all of these other interactions, breaking it up, was helpful as a structure.
Yeah. I mean, and this is like a book where it's like you're debuting right now while we're in quarantine through like a pandemic, where there is like people dealing so much with grief and like anxiety and stress, and like how do you deal with that? Like, does it feel like very strange to be like putting a book out that is dealing with like this very specific kind of grief and loss, like during this very specific period of time?
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think partially because the death is so kind of blameless, like it is an accident. It's a death that is no one's fault. Mm-hmm. It is a car that swerves into a tree because There's an animal running across the road. or that's probably what happened. I mean, the police don't even know.
Mhm.
But I think because of that, my hope is that sort of that is a kind of grief that then other kinds of grief can be mapped onto, for those of us at home who are grieving or fearing a future grief or sort of waiting on the unknown of a possible grief. Maybe it can be a place to sort of map those feelings onto, because at least as a reader, I know that when I can't access certain feelings or when I don't want to access certain feelings, I turn to books to let me feel things or to help me feel things, because then I can feel things through characters and then also go on with my life like a person.
Right, like kind of like an intermediary kind of way to process.
Mm-hmm.
You do a really interesting job, I think, with the process of grief for Maggie. Is you're like, she's furious and she's very upset, and some of that gets like, right, like it's an easy way, especially if you have like a fraught relationship with a person who has died, to displace a lot of like frustration and anger onto that person who's no longer there. And then you have, but also you have her brother who's dealing with it at the same time, and then her father. And her relationship with her father is really interesting to me because it's like they've always been closer, right? They've always seemed to understand each other more. Like she like freely acknowledges that her mother has like a better connection with like her brother, but like for her father, she and her father have a closer connection. But when she comes back home and after her mother has died, he's like, they almost kind of reverse roles where he needs care and she's like, I'm in a position now where I'm having to parent. So like, what was that like kind of writing into this kind of like reversal of roles, like the parent child dynamic kind of like flipping on itself? It was very fascinating to me. So I was interested to hear like your take on what writing that would be like.
Yeah, the way that you just said it actually, I think, made it click in my head where that came from. Because I didn't even think so much about it as I was writing it. It seemed like a very natural possibility to me that this could happen. But I mean, my father passed away when I was 16, but before that, he was ill for a long time. And one of the things that I was able to do was provide a kind of caretaking role. I mean, I was able to do some things that he either physically couldn't do or that were difficult for my mother to do because she's more squeamish than I am about certain things. And I sort of was able to deal with things like, changing bandages around icky sort of, spaces where there were tubes or things going into the body. And, so that was something that I was able to draw strength from, I think, at the time, which I don't know if I was aware of it then. And I don't think I was aware of it at all when I was writing those scenes now. I mean, for this book, but just the way that you put that now about it being a caretaking role, right? That's interesting because I think that it probably is where I was drawing that from. Yeah. And I think many kids go through that, right? Like,
yeah, absolutely.
At various ages, you need to take care of a parent at some point for some reason.
Yeah. I think that kind of role reversal just like sometimes occurs, especially in moments of like extreme trauma or loss or grief. There's like kind of like a very specific kind of shift in like how the caretaking takes place, right? I mean, and she's in a very odd space too, because she's back in her childhood home. And there's like this, there's this scene where she's like first goes back into her bedroom and describes it, where it's like, here I am back in like my childhood bedroom and nothing has changed. And she's like laying back on the bed and like looking at the ceiling and seeing things, and like that kind of immediate like immersion back into the past, right? Where it's like you feel yourself in the present, but the self of your past like kind of like layers up upon it and you cannot escape it. And I think the book does a really good job of like showing the reader something that's like supremely relatable. This idea of like, I've developed myself into my own kind of person. I've like left home and I'm queer and this is my life. And I'm like, not really that. I mean, I don't have like a huge relationship with my mom, but like, what does it look like the minute you go home and the minute you're like in your bedroom? Like, what does that look like? It does a great job with it, I think.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think that I mean, it's so visceral, right? Like if you have a childhood home that you go back to or a childhood bedroom that you go back to, if it's the same in any way, right? Or if there's remnants of your past there, or if you can even just think about like what it looked like. I feel like that's one of those visceral reminders of what that time was like, because I mean, as teenagers especially, how much time do you spend in whatever space that you can cultivate for yourself, whether that's your own room or your own corner of your bedroom,
right?
Your own corner of whatever space you've made for yourself that is somehow feels private, or your
small
own
little haven, like a kind of small carved out spot. Yeah.
Right. And sometimes you take that spot with you, right? Like whether it's your backpack that like you put all the stickers on, right?
Right.
I mean, there's all sorts of ways in which this manifests, but I feel that there's a certain time as a teenager where you just spend so much time with a particular grouping of stuff or a particular grouping of ideas that you get obsessed with, or you need to hold on to in order to feel yourself and to channel your feelings through. And it kind of is like a time machine, right? Like it takes you back there when you get that stuff again.
Yeah. I mean, I think whether you want it to or not.
Right.
Like,
oh, yes, exactly. Sometimes in a bad way.
It's like sadly we cannot control memory.
No.
We'd very much like to. I know we have to take audience questions. I just want to ask you one more,
Yes.
if you don't mind, because this book is like, I mean, I'm such a place writer, and I'm so focused on place. This book is like supremely a specific kind of like driving through California and like what's that like. So when you were writing this, there's so many like descriptions of like what the air is like, what the plant life is like, what the buildings look like, what even home looks like. I mean, when you were writing this, was there like a specific like spot or like way that you thought about place and in which writing this book like came through for you?
Yes. So California I was born in Los Angeles. And so I have these memories of being driven rather around LA every time we visited LA, where my grandparents lived, and just that soothing feeling of being driven places through a landscape that was very different than the one I grew up in for the rest of my life. And it was always very different when I was there. It just like, I don't know, California feels like something.
Yeah.
But I will say that I also like deeply cheated, because so what I mean is that I looked up places on Google Maps and went down to
research. That's fine.
But I mean, like I literally like would go down the route.
I love that.
Like on Street View, and then I would do the thing where like you can turn the map to the right or left, and I would look at the building, and I would just choose arbitrarily sometimes, or I would look up the neighborhood of like, okay, where would someone live if they were this kind of income and this kind of da 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 da. And then I would sort of look at the various houses and just choose one that I liked and be like, okay, that's that character's house, and then I would describe it.
I need to tell you right now, that's not cheating. That's you literally doing research. That's amazing.
I'm not good at visualizations in general. So like, it was very useful to have that technology with me.
I love that. And I think everyone should do it. That should be something that we all try out. I really like that a lot.
Yeah, it was very fun, actually, and useful.
Yeah, I mean, because you do a lot of things too, where it's like, right, like so much of like Los Angeles is like, right, like being stuck in a car and like in traffic, and like there's that feeling, because that's part of being in place there, and it's just very vivid, and it comes through. I went above my time. I wanted to talk to you so much, but I'll let us go to questions from other people.
Well, if there aren't any, we can keep going.
There definitely are. Yes.
Oh, okay.
I do have a question from the chat. Who was the hardest character to write? I wonder if it might be Maggie's father, which, Kristen, you made me think about by talking about that role reversal. I remember for the first 100 or so pages, Maggie's father is, when he's in the book, he's, shocked or in a state of grief. And it's interesting because nowhere else in the book do you, at least in those first 100 pages, you never see him being normal. And so when you read scenes with him in it, you wonder, you could still tell that something wasn't quite right, but you had never seen him be normal, which is an incredible thing. But who is the hardest character to write?
Gosh. I mean, Maggie, right? I mean, I feel like I don't know if that's a good or bad answer, but like, because she's the main character, who's there's the most pages spent on her. You know, I mean, there were other characters I needed to sort of think through sometimes a lot more than what's on the page, and that could be difficult, where I was sort of just doing all of this thinking or writing or research that, like, you know, this sort of iceberg theory, right? Like, where like this much of it ended up on the page because none of the other stuff that I was thinking about mattered, but I needed to know so that I could sort of understand who they were. But I mean, Maggie, somewhere in the middle, as I was writing, I sort of wasn't sure if she had a personality, and I think because I was so immersed, I was just like, is she anyone? Is she just a blank slate? I'm not even sure anymore. So I think just sort of keeping hold of who she was the most difficult.
I also have a question from somebody about your efforts before All My Mother's Lovers that you said were less plot driven, and whether you or less clearly plot driven, and whether you would go back and work on them again, or whether they're just in the rear.
Oh yes. I mean, not necessarily those, but in general, I love reading all sorts of things, but in terms of my own writing, I'm so bad at plot usually. This is really like the rare occasion where I had a real plot.
So you're not going to sit and wait for another set of letters to come to you.
No, I mean, what I'm working on now sort of has a built-in kind of plot because it's based on and related to real people. So they, you know, the real things happen to them. So there are real events that are related. But I'm in general really interested in sort of experimental structures and in working with sort of different kinds of voices in the same book. And yeah, so I there's one of the books that I've written in the past that I would really, really like to return to. And it's sort of the only one that I think I will ever go back to and try to resurrect in some way. And that one is very strange and has very little plot and is mostly language driven, but I like it. And I don't know, one of my friends really likes it, so maybe one day.
Were there any novels that you consulted to help you wrap your head around the mechanics of plot? Because I don't really read for plot either, typically. I thought the plot in here was great, but in imagining how anybody could ever engineer a plot, I would need some object lessons or some examples to follow. So were there any, like I'm thinking of like John Irving. John Irving could write a plot. Are there any people that you consulted in?
That's so interesting that you say that about John Irving, because like, could he?
I know, they're ridiculous.
He's amazing. I love him, but like his plots are not like the thing about his book. I mean, I feel like his books are about his characters and the weird shit they do. Yeah. And the plots are kind of like, oh, well, let's have a car crash, and then let's see what happens, and let's have someone cheat, and then let's see what happens. And that's a way of building a plot. I mean, I'm not saying it isn't. His writing is so remarkable, like on the sentence level and on the character level, that it just doesn't matter. But I mean, when you put a bear in every book in order to find a moment of plot, I'm just saying. Right. And that's not to knock.
That was so, I just have to unmute myself. That was so funny to me.
It's a signature move. I think it's like purposeful, right? He has a thing with bears. But no, I mean, so I you know, I mean, as a book critic, I'm reading books all the time, both for my job, and then I've been in school, so I've just been reading all sorts of different kinds of books. And I'm a voracious reader anyway, and I don't read for plot, even though I love plots. So I mean, I admire when people can do them well. I think that I read a screenwriting book once, one single screenwriting book on the suggestion of someone who I worked with at a writer's space in New York. And it was really interesting because even though like I've never really followed any of it, like I've not followed the sort of actual structure. There are just these key little moments of how screenplays work that I think have subconsciously now entered my mind. So it would Save the Cat if anyone is interested. It's an okay book. It's like, eh. But the thing that it's really good at reminding you is like there are these sort of moments of tension that even if everything else is sort of like, if you have those like, here's a moment, and there's a moment, and there's a moment, then it kind of feels like a plot. And I think that's what I've learned is that a lot of novelists who write plots that are really literary, they have those moments, and that's why it feels so much like there's a real plot, even though it's like, I mean, I think plot is overrated anyway as like a necessity, but that also depends on genre. It depends on a lot of things. So
I have another question from the chat. Can you talk more about how your work as a critic informed how you wrote this book?
Well, I mean, I think that's probably partly it. It was just this sort of thinking of, you know, just thinking of everything I'd read, right? I mean, I don't think it was necessarily conscious, but everything that I read trickles down and in and through, you know? So I'm sure that, again, subconsciously just reading so many books as a critic over the last few years must have informed something in terms of those points, right? Like those points of tension that occur and how those can carry a book and a character forward.
And somebody asks, what's next? Of course, always the evergreen question of what's next.
Well, I mean, it's still in the very like phases where I'm just thinking about it and sort of doing some background writing and research and trying to figure things out. It's historical, which I've never done before, so that's really scary because I feel like I'm not going to know when to stop researching. Not super historical, like 60s. The most fun research that I've been doing about that, though, has been just reading, trying to get my hands onto copies of The Ladder, which is the lesbian journal or the lesbian magazine published by the Daughters of Bilitis, which was the lesbian organization that existed in the 50s and 60s. It existed until much later, but it sort of it stopped being the vital, sort of very relevant, necessary space that it had been before Stonewall. But they were interesting. They were so interesting and so vital and just, yeah. So I'm reading that and reading, like, listening to people talk about that time. I've been listening to a lot of Making Gay History, which is a great podcast. If anyone is interested in oral histories of the sort of various gay parts of this country, at least, and the movement here. And yeah, and aliens, I guess, maybe. I'm not sure. We'll see how much the aliens come into it. But I'm thinking all sorts of things, and I have no idea yet how any of it is going to tie exactly together. But yeah, aliens and lesbians from the 50s.
I have one more question from me. It's maybe an annoying question, but and I don't want to jinx anything, but this would clearly be a great movie, not just because of Los Angeles and everything else, but I mean, you could just see it. And so before that happens, let me ask, dream director and dream Maggie.
Okay, so I don't know enough about movies, so I feel like I don't know who the director would be. I will say this, I loved Booksmart. And so if the director of Booksmart wanted to take it on, who, you know, was also 13 in House, I believe, and at least played a bisexual, even if she's not in real life. I'm not sure. I mean, I don't know what her sexuality is, but she played one really convincingly. She made a lot of us like drool. So, you know, that's something. but if she wanted to direct it, that would be cool. And in terms of Dream Maggie, again, because I feel like I don't know enough young actors, like contemporary actors. I keep seeing people who I like point to in TV shows, and I'm like, ooh, that would make a good something. But usually it's from like 20 years ago, and it's like not relevant anymore because I'm I'm watching the X-Files right now for the very first time. So literally really old stuff, not useful. Although, I will say that Gillian Anderson is Iris. That would be great. Yeah, because she's she's a little young, but she's a little bit younger than Iris. But I think, the way that we age women up in Hollywood anyway, this would be like just a 5 or 6 year jump for her, which, that's not bad. Usually women in their 30s are playing women in their 60s. So I think we can improve upon that.
I think that's all we have time for. But one last time, congratulations again on the publication of this wonderful, wonderful, wonderful book. I'll post the link one more time. If you don't have it already, I hope you'll buy it from McNally Jackson. But this was just a lot of fun. And so I'm glad we could do this. I know you have a book cake waiting for you. And so I will let you go eat the book cake. But thank you everybody for joining us. Kristen, thank you for leading us, and Ilana, again, congratulations. And
thank you, Ilana. Happy birthday! Yay!
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. And please do support McNally Jackson. Like, they're so awesome. I spend so many hours just in the Prince Street location, listening to other writers, and just like being enveloped in their book smell and in their beautiful, book ambiance. And so I really do love them. And
we'll bring you back to the paperback.
Yeah.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, John, so much for organizing this.
Of course. Have a good night, everybody. Thanks again. Be safe, be well, and we'll see you soon.